Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me for another video. This week I want to talk about tripods. Now there was a time not so long ago when no self-respecting landscape photographer would leave home without their tripod. But with the growth in popularity of mirrorless cameras and improvements in technology such as image stabilisation and improvements in low light performance, more and more of us are finding that we're leaving our tripods at home more and more often, and we're shooting handheld a lot more frequently. So in this video, I want to look at the pros and cons of each approach and ask the question, which is better for landscape photography? But before we get to that, let's just re-familiarise ourselves with my tripod. So this is my tripod. It is a Benro Mach 3 TMA 48 CXL. Most importantly, it is a 4-section carbon fibre tripod. And I bought it because it's very tall. It extends above 2 meters, so I can get it above my head height. And I find that really, really useful under certain circumstances, creating separation between my foreground and my background. Sometimes I want to get my camera really high, and this tripod is perfect for it. I've paired it with a Benro B2 ball head, and then I have a Benro LPC 6D L bracket, which is made specifically for my camera. And this allows me to mount my camera in portrait orientation, and that keeps it nice and central and stable at all times. For a long time now, my main camera has been a DSLR. This DSLR, in fact, it's a Canon 6D full-frame DSLR. And since I got it, I've become addicted to using the LCD on the back. I use it for everything. I use it for composition, I use it for exposure, I even use it for focusing. And I find that I can only use the LCD when the camera's mounted on a tripod. If I try and use it handheld, I end up sort of waving it around a bit, and it's quite clumsy. And that means that when I use my DSLR, it's always mounted on a tripod. I never shoot with my DSLR handheld. My backup camera is a mirrorless camera. It's actually the camera that I'm using to film this now. And back in March 2020, when the UK government put us all under lockdown because of the coronavirus pandemic, I found that I was only able to go outside to exercise. Now, I still wanted to continue to take photos throughout lockdown, so I decided to take my camera with me. I didn't want to take that big DSLR that's quite heavy, quite cumbersome, and a little bit too obvious, so I decided to take the little Canon M50. And I also didn't want to take a tripod with me, so throughout lockdown I shot exclusively handheld. Now I found that the information displayed on the EVF on that little camera was exactly the same as the information that was on the LCD on the back of my DSLR. And this meant that I could continue to shoot in manual exposure mode, controlling the shutter speed to set the exposure based on the histogram that I could see in the EVF, but I was no longer tied to my tripod. For me, one of the biggest advantages of shooting on a tripod is that it slows you right down. It gives you the opportunity to assess the scene and fine-tune your composition, to scan the edges of your frame looking for distractions, and to assess every single element that's in the image and ask, is that adding anything to the overall photograph, or is it actually taking away? I think because tripods slow you down, I tend to only use them when I have a good idea of the composition that I want to shoot. That way, it doesn't get in the way when I'm trying to run from one composition to the next. If tripods slow you down, then shooting handheld can definitely speed you up. The problem I find with tripods is that I tend to remain anchored to one position. The problem is that they're very cumbersome, very clumsy when you try to move them, and that can actually stop me from exploring a location, trying to find different compositions. I find that when I shoot handheld, I have a greater tendency to try different compositions. I might try and get lower or higher, move closer to the subject, or further away, try different angles. And that helps me to explore a scene more and come up with different possibilities. And I tend to be a lot more creative when I shoot handheld. Because I'm more inclined to explore a location, because I'm more creative, I tend to shoot handheld when I come to a location for the very first time and I don't know the composition that I want to shoot. Now obviously one of the best things about tripods is that they keep your camera stable under most circumstances. And I think for the vast majority of photographers, they're still the preferred option for low light photography. Now I myself do a lot of shooting around sunrise and I typically start shooting about an hour before the sun has broken the horizon and I continue shooting for an hour and a half after it's risen. And so those are pretty typical low light conditions. And I find that under those circumstances, generally my best option is to mount my camera on a tripod. The problem with trying to shoot handheld in low light conditions is you can struggle to get a fast enough shutter speed to avoid camera shake creating blurry images. And generally in order to do that, you have to bump up the ISO. Now on my DSLR, I can effectively shoot up to around an ISO of about 800. And then it's starting to get a little bit grainy. I'm starting to lose a little bit of image quality. However, on my mirrorless camera, which is a crop sensor, really my limit for ISO is about 400. And even then, it's really quite grainy. And if I try and lift any details out of the shadows, that just worsens the problem. The way that the camera manufacturers are choosing to deal with this problem is by developing image stabilisation. Now, I'll be honest, this isn't something that I know an awful lot about, but I do know that a lot of the latest mirrorless systems have image stabilisation built into the cameras themselves. Now, when I'm out on location, I often find myself shooting at shutter speeds of more than a second. And it's my understanding that the image stabilisation isn't sophisticated enough to allow me to use such a slow shutter speed. But if I've got that wrong, please let me know by leaving a comment below. Obviously, one of the main disadvantages of tripods is that they weigh so much. So my tripod weighs something like 3 kilos. And believe you me, I felt every single one of those kilos as I've just climbed up the top of King's How with it strapped to my back. And I know this isn't the subject of the video, but what was the point? Have you ever seen light this bad? Now typically I wouldn't bring my tripod up into the mountains. Normally I only use my tripod when I'm shooting around the edges of the lakes and I'm pretty close to the car. But if I'm hiking over long distances or I'm hiking up into the mountains, I tend to leave my tripod at home and shoot handheld. Now a lot of people will advocate the use of a lightweight tripod when you're up in the hills, but then you get into the tripod conundrum. As you climb higher, the chances are you'll get stronger winds. And in stronger winds, you need a sturdier tripod. And sturdier tripods are generally heavier. Now I find that my approach to photography has a big impact on my decision whether or not I want to shoot with a tripod or not. Now I have two very distinct approaches to my photography. The first one involves me going out and trying to get an image that may ultimately make it into my shop to be sold as a print. And in those circumstances, the primary reason for me being outdoors is photography. And under those circumstances, I tend to shoot on my DSLR with it mounted on a tripod. More recently, I've found that I've started to take a more documentary approach to some of my photography. And these are the occasions when my reason for being outside is something other than photography. And under those circumstances, what I actually do is I take my camera along with me to document my time outdoors. And under those circumstances, I generally find that I leave the tripod at home and shoot handheld using a mirrorless camera. Filters play a really important role in my photography. I think it's very, very rare for me to take a photograph without some form of filtration. Typically, I use a polarizer to reduce glare and reflections. I use a graduated ND filter to balance my exposure and darken my sky. And on some occasions I use ND filters to increase my shutter speed so that I can blur motion in the landscape. It is so much easier for me to use filters when my camera is mounted on a tripod. It's much easier for me to position my graduated filters, and of course I need my camera really stable when I'm using ND filters to do long exposures. Probably the only filter that I ever really use when I'm shooting handheld is a polarizer, and I use that pretty sparingly. Typically I'll only use it when I'm trying to take the reflections off of the surface of mountain tarns. Now, another occasion when I find using a tripod really helpful is if I want to take multiple exposures to create a single image. So for example, if I'm taking a panorama or if I'm doing some form of exposure blending. Now, I do know that it is possible to do both of those while shooting handheld, but I find that I get much more consistent results if I shoot on a tripod. Another time when I find a tripod absolutely essential is when I'm doing long exposures. Now, in these circumstances, my exposure time could be a minute, it could be 2 minutes, it could be as much as 4 minutes. And I don't think that you're ever going to be able to do a 4-minute exposure handheld and get everything pin sharp. I might be wrong, but I think the only way that you can shoot at 4 minutes handheld is if you're going for some kind of groovy ICM type photo. So, to summarise, my decision to shoot handheld or to use a tripod is very much based on the situation that I find myself in. I will typically use a tripod if I'm shooting with my DSLR, if I'm visiting a location that I know and I know my composition, if I'm not too far away from the car, and if my intention is to take a single image that may turn into a print that I can sell through my shop. But I find more often that I want to shoot handheld if I'm using a mirrorless camera, if I'm visiting a location for the first time and I don't know my composition, if I'm hiking long distances, particularly if I'm heading up into the fells, and if my intention is to take multiple images that I will combine to tell a story of my day. So there you go, that's it for this video. If you found it useful, do please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to share some of your experience about either shooting with a tripod or shooting handheld, then please do feel free to leave a comment below. Particularly if you can explain under what circumstances you will try one approach or another. And I do try and read every single comment, and I do learn an awful lot from reading the comments that people leave under my videos. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and hopefully you'll join me next week for another video, and we're going to be talking about some of the beginner mistakes that I see all the time, and of course those beginner mistakes that I've made myself.